in the grimy, soot-stained heart of 1920s Chicago, in a cold-water flat above a butcher shop that always smelled of iron and sawdust, the bodies of 3 men were found. They weren't rivals, not in the traditional sense. They were family. 2 were the sons-in-law of Don Antonio the architect Morello, a man who built his empire not just on illegal booze and backroom gambling, but on blood and bone. The 3rd man, found in the center of the room with a single respectful gunshot wound to the heart, was his prized soldier, a monstrously strong enforcer, known only as Il Mastino, the Mastiff. The scene was a bloody Baroque tableau of a family feud gone spectacularly wrong. But the most chilling detail wasn't the bodies. It was what was missing. The architect's 3 daughters, Isabella, Sophia, and Lucia, were gone, and so was the Don himself. The papers screamed of a gangland hit, a brutal decapitation of the Morello crime family. But the whispers on the street, the stories told in hushed tones in the speakeasies and union halls, spoke of something far darker. They spoke of a monstrous pact, a grotesque experiment in Dynasty building that had finally, violently, imploded. This video will answer the question that the police and the press were too afraid to even ask. What happened to the Morello dynasty? The story wasn't about a rival gang. It was about a father's pathological obsession with his own bloodline. A mafia boss who, in his quest for the perfect heirs, decided to breed his own 3 daughters with his strongest, most loyal soldier. He didn't just want to create a crime family. He wanted to forge a new, superior lineage, a dynasty of his own twisted design. This is the story of that soldier, the Mastiff, a man bred for violence but cursed with a conscience. It's the story of 3 sisters raised as princesses in a gilded cage who were turned into broodmares for their father's ambition. And it's the story of how their desperate, bloody rebellion brought an entire criminal empire crashing down. To understand how a father's love could curdle into such a monstrous obsession, we must go back 5 years, to a lavish wedding feast where the seeds of this dynasty were first sown in blood and betrayal. Don Antonio Morello, the architect, saw the world in terms of foundations, structures, and legacies. He hadn't clawed his way up from the filth of the Little Italy tenements, his hands raw and his knuckles broken, just to build something that would crumble after he was gone. His empire, a sprawling network of speakeasies, protection rackets, and political puppets, was a monument to his will. But as he entered his late 50s, a gnawing fear began to consume him. He had no sons. His wife, a frail woman worn down by his world, had given him 3 daughters before passing into an early grave. 3 beautiful, intelligent, and, in his eyes, tragically flawed pillars for his dynasty. They were not the steel beams he needed, but delicate porcelain vases. Isabella, the eldest, was cunning and observant, with her father's strategic mind but a woman's soft heart. Sophia, the middle child, was a fiery beauty, passionate and rebellious, a spark of defiance that both thrilled and terrified him. Lucia, the youngest, was gentle and kind, a creature of pure empathy in a world that had no use for it. He loved them, in his own possessive, suffocating way, but he saw their marriages as a weakness, a dilution of his precious bloodline. The event that crystallized his fear into a monstrous plan was the wedding of his eldest, Isabella, to a man named Marco, the son of a fellow mafioso from a lesser family. The wedding was a grand affair, a sea of silk, champagne, and forced smiles. From his ornate, throne-like chair, the architect watched the union with a sour taste in his mouth. He saw Marco not as a son, but as a parasite, a weak link who would leech off the Morello name and produce soft, worthless heirs. It was during the reception held in the cavernous main hall of his Southside mansion that he first saw the solution to his problem. An argument had broken out between 2 of his capos, their drunken words escalating toward violence. Before anyone could intervene, a figure moved through the crowd with the silent, inexorable force of a landslide. It was Rico Il Mastino Bastone. Rico was more of a force of nature than a man. He was a mountain of muscle and quiet loyalty, a soldier the architect had taken in as an orphan boy and molded into his personal instrument of violence. He didn't speak. He simply placed one massive hand on each capo's chest and pushed them apart as if they were unruly children. The room fell silent. There was no anger in Rico's eyes, only a calm, absolute certainty of his own strength. In that moment, watching the sheer physical dominance and unwavering loyalty of the Mastiff, the dark seed of an idea planted itself in the architect's mind. He saw in Rico not just a soldier, but the perfect sire. Pure, untainted strength, unquestioning loyalty, a bloodline forged in hardship, not softened by the easy living his daughter's suitors offered. He looked from the magnificent, brutal specimen of a man to his delicate daughter and her foppish new husband, and the grotesque equation began to form in his mind. Why import weak materials when he could build his dynasty with the finest stock he already owned? That night, as the wedding festivities wound down, the architect made a decision. The marriages of his other two daughters would be different, and Isabella's. Her marriage would be the first foundation he would have to tear down. The first few months of Isabella's marriage to Marco were a study in quiet misery. Marco, eager to prove his worth to his terrifying father-in-law, was a bundle of nervous ambition. He tried to involve himself in the family business, offering suggestions at meetings and attempting to assert a pathetic authority over men who had known him since he was a boy in short trousers. The architect watched these attempts with a cold, contemptuous amusement. He would listen to Marco's ill-conceived plans with a placid smile, then systematically dissect them, exposing their flaws with surgical precision until the young man was left stammering and humiliated in front of the other capos. It was a slow, psychological dismantling, a public display of Marco's inadequacy. Isabella, with her father's sharp intellect, saw exactly what was happening. She saw the cruel game her father was playing, and it filled her with a mixture of fear and fury. She tried to warn Marco, to coach him, to urge him to be more cautious. "You don't challenge him, Marco," she would whisper late at night in their opulent, lonely bedroom. "You listen, you learn, you wait." But Marco was too proud, too desperate to earn the Don's respect, to heed her warnings. He saw her advice not as protection, but as a woman's interference in the world of men. Rico, the Mastiff, was a silent observer to all of this. His duties often placed him as the architect's shadow, a hulking presence in the corner of the room during these tense family meetings. He watched Marco's preening and posturing, and he saw the flicker of pain in Isabella's eyes each time her husband made a fool of himself. Rico had grown up in the Morello household, a ghost in the halls. He had watched the three sisters grow from children into women. He felt a fierce, secret protectiveness toward them, the kind a loyal guard dog feels for its master's family. He saw their father's cold calculations, and for the first time in his life of blind obedience, a flicker of something akin to dissent stirred within him. The final, fatal crack in the foundation of Isabella's marriage came on a sweltering August night. The architect had called a meeting to discuss a new bootlegging route. Marco, after a day of drinking to soothe his bruised ego, saw his chance to finally impress the Don. He proposed a bold, reckless plan to hijack a shipment belonging to the rival O'Banion crew. The architect listened, his face an unreadable mask. When Marco finished his impassioned speech, the Don turned to Rico. "Mastino," he said, his voice soft. "You've been scouting the north side. Tell me about this route." Rico's voice, a low, gravelly rumble rarely heard, filled the room. In simple, direct terms, he explained that the route was a trap. O'Banion knew they were coming. The drop point was a bottleneck, easily ambushed. He laid out the facts without emotion, a simple assessment of risk. Marco, his face flushed with wine and anger, flew into a rage. "He's just a dumb mutt, a piece of muscle," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Rico. "What does he know of strategy? I say we hit them." Don Morello slowly rose from his chair. The room grew deathly quiet. He walked over to Marco, placed a fatherly hand on his shoulder, and smiled a chilling, reptilian smile. "You have passion, my son," he said. "It is a valuable thing." Then, without warning, he drove his fist into Marco's stomach. The young man crumpled, gasping for air. "But passion without intellect," the architect hissed, standing over him, "is a liability. You are a liability." He looked at Rico. "Clean this up." That night, Marco was sent on a special assignment from which he would not return. The official story was that he had been killed in a heroic, if foolish, attempt to fight the O'Banion gang. Isabella was a widow, and the architect's grand, grotesque project could now truly begin. With Marco gone, a funereal quiet settled over the Morello mansion, but it was a silence thick with unspoken intentions. Isabella, now a widow in her own home, was treated with a suffocating, solicitous care by her father that felt more like possession than concern. He paraded her grief before his men as a symbol of the family's sacrifice, while privately reminding her that her duty was now solely to the Morello name. The tragic widow was a powerful image, but the architect had no intention of letting her remain one for long. He began to change Rico's duties. The Mastiff was no longer just a shadow in the corner of the room. He was assigned as Isabella's personal bodyguard, a constant, silent presence by her side. He drove her to church, stood guard outside her door, and watched over the gardens as she took her morning walks. The arrangement was, on the surface, a sensible precaution. But to everyone in the household, the true meaning was chillingly clear. The dawn was pairing them. It was an unspoken contract, sealed not with ink, but with intimidation and the fresh memory of Marco's fate. Isabella understood immediately. She was trapped. To refuse her father's unspoken command would be an act of suicidal defiance. Yet, the thought of being with Rico, the man who had so calmly predicted the events that led to her husband's death, filled her with a complex storm of emotions. She hated him for his role in her father's world, for his silent, brutal efficiency, but she also saw in him a quiet strength that her foolish husband had so desperately lacked. He was a creature of her father's making, yet he did not seem to possess her father's cruelty. His eyes, when they occasionally met hers, held not the coldness of a killer, but a deep, world-weary sorrow. Rico, for his part, was living in a quiet hell. He had pledged his life to Antonio Morello, the man who had saved him from a starving orphan's death. Loyalty was the only code he had ever known, but this new command was a violation of that code. He was a soldier, a protector. He was not a stud horse to be used for breeding. The silent moments he now spent in Isabella's presence were excruciating. He felt her fear, her resentment, and something else he couldn't name. He had watched her grow up, a distant, almost mythical creature of grace and beauty from a world he could never inhabit. To be forced upon her as a mate was the deepest dishonor he could imagine. The Don orchestrated their union with the patient subtlety of a spider weaving its web. He would contrive situations that left them alone together for hours. He would speak glowingly of Rico's loyalty and strength in Isabella's presence, praising him as the truest son he had ever had. He was not asking, he was conditioning them, normalizing the monstrous, until the inevitable seemed not just necessary, but natural. One evening, the architect summoned Isabella to his study. The room was dark, smelling of cigar smoke and leather. Rico stood by the door, his face carved from stone. "You are my firstborn," the Don began, his voice laced with a predatory softness. "You are the foundation of my legacy. Marco was a mistake, a crack in that foundation. We have repaired it." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "A house needs a strong cornerstone. A bloodline needs a strong seed. Rico is that seed. He is pure. He is loyal. He is strong. The children you give me with him will be Morellos in spirit and in blood. They will be lions, not lambs." Isabella stood frozen, her heart a block of ice in her chest. It was the first time the unspoken had been spoken. It was a command, an absolution, and a death sentence for any hope of a life of her own. She looked past her father to the silent figure at the door. Rico's gaze was fixed on the floor, his massive hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was as much a prisoner as she was. In that shared, silent moment of despair, the unspoken contract was sealed. She would submit to her father's will to survive. But as she gave her silent, terrified nod, a single, cold thought took root in her mind. A foundation built on such a monstrous crime could never be expected to stand. While Isabella was being slowly, inexorably bound to Rico, the architect turned his attention to his other two daughters, Sophia and Lucia. Their impending marriages, once a source of anxiety, were now opportunities to perfect his grotesque design. He would not repeat the mistake he had made with Marco. There would be no more weak-willed outsiders diluting his bloodline. He announced to his capos that his daughters were not to be courted. Their futures, he declared, were a matter of family, of strengthening the Morello line from within. The message was clear. His daughters were off limits. Their hands were not being offered. They were being reserved. Sophia, the rebellious one, did not take this well. She was secretly in love with a young musician, a man so far removed from her father's world that his existence was a dangerous fantasy. They met in secret, in clandestine moments, stolen in public parks and crowded libraries. She dreamed of escape, of a life where she was not a pawn in her father's games. But her father's eyes were everywhere. One afternoon, the architect summoned her to the conservatory, a glass room filled with exotic, suffocatingly fragrant flowers. He was pruning a rosebush with a pair of silver shears. "I hear you have a fondness for music," he said without looking up. "A young man with a violin. How charming." Sophia's blood ran cold. She denied it, but her trembling voice was a confession. "Sophia, my fiery girl," her father said, finally turning to her, the shears glinting in the light. "Passion is a beautiful thing, but like a fire, it must be contained, or it will burn the whole house down." He snipped a perfect blood-red rose from its stem. "This young man is a weed in my garden, and I have had him plucked." The casual brutality of his words shattered her. She didn't have to ask what plucked meant. The despair was a physical blow, leaving her hollowed out and empty. Her rebellion was over before it had even begun. Her dreams turned to ash. Lucia, the gentle youngest daughter, had no secret lover. Her heart was pure, her nature trusting. When her father told her that her future husband would be chosen for the good of the family, she accepted it with a quiet, sorrowful resignation. She did not understand the dark specifics of her father's plan, but she felt the chilling change in the atmosphere of the house. She saw the haunted look in Isabella's eyes, the new, forced proximity to the silent enforcer, Rico. She saw the light go out in Sophia's fiery spirit. Lucia retreated into herself, finding solace in her books and her prayers, a fragile bird in a cage full of predators. With his daughters properly corralled, one widowed and bound, one broken and one submissive, the architect prepared for the next phase. He held a formal dinner for his inner circle. At the end of the meal, he stood and made a proclamation. "My daughters will honor their family," he announced, his voice booming through the hall. "They will provide this family with its future, with the strongest blood. They will be wed to a man who has proven his absolute loyalty, a man of unparalleled strength." He then gestured to the foot of the table, where Rico sat, uncomfortable and out of place in a borrowed suit. "They will all be wed to Rico Bastone." A stunned silence fell over the room. Even for these hardened criminals, this was a shocking breach of tradition, of religion, of decency. To marry one man to three sisters was a perversion, but no one dared voice their objection. They looked at the Don's cold, determined face. They looked at the immense, miserable form of the mastiff, and they looked at the three pale, beautiful daughters, standing behind their father like porcelain dolls on a shelf. In that moment, they were no longer Isabella, Sophia, and Lucia. They were the three pillars of a new, monstrous dynasty, and their father, the architect, had just laid their foundation in the deepest, darkest pit of his own madness. The wedding was not a ceremony of God, but a declaration of ownership. In the grand ballroom of his mansion before his most trusted men, Antonio Morello announced the union. He did not use words like marriage or love, but spoke of alliance, blood, and legacy. He presented his daughters, dressed in fine but somber gowns, and Rico, standing stiffly in a suit that looked like a costume on his massive frame. He had a corrupt judge, a man long on his payroll, sign a series of legal documents that were a mockery of the law, effectively making the three women Rico's wards, their assets, and their persons under his legal control. A control that everyone in the room knew was merely an extension of the architect's. The house, which had once been a home, transformed into a gilded cage. The three sisters, now bound to one man in a grotesque parody of marriage, were prisoners in their own rooms. Their father's obsession with control became absolute. They were not allowed to leave the house without Rico as their escort. Their mail was read, their calls monitored. Their old friends were turned away at the gates. Their world shrank to the opulent, suffocating confines of the mansion and its manicured gardens. The dynamic between the sisters began to fracture under the strain. Isabella, the pragmatist, tried to adapt, to find a way to survive the unsurvivable. She treated her relationship with Rico as a grim transaction, a duty to be performed to keep her father's madness at bay. She would speak to him in calm, measured tones, discussing household matters as if theirs was a normal, albeit crowded, marriage. It was a coping mechanism, a way to maintain a semblance of control in a situation where she had none. Sophia, her spirit of rebellion crushed but not extinguished, reacted with simmering, silent rage. She despised Rico as the instrument of her father's tyranny and the symbol of her own lost love. She refused to speak to him, turning her back when he entered a room, her eyes burning with a hatred that was a constant, palpable force in the house. She saw Isabella's pragmatism as a betrayal, a weak-willed surrender. Lucia, the gentle one, simply withered. The ugliness of her reality was too much for her sensitive soul. She retreated into a world of books, spending her days in the library, a ghost in her own home. She was terrified of Rico, terrified of her father, and heartbroken by the growing chasm between her sisters. The cage was breaking them, turning them against each other, just as the architect had intended. A united front was a threat. Fractured, they were manageable. Rico's life became a waking nightmare. He was forced to play the part of husband to three women who either hated him, feared him, or treated him like a piece of necessary furniture. He slept on a small cot in an antechamber connecting the three sisters' bedrooms, a guard and a stud, but never a husband. He ate his meals in the kitchen with the other staff, unable to bear the suffocating tension of the family dinner table. The loyalty that had been the bedrock of his existence was now a poison. He was bound by an oath to a man he was beginning to realize was a monster. Every day, he saw the pain in the sisters' eyes. He saw Isabella's forced composure, Sophia's burning hatred, and Lucia's fragile decline. He had been raised to be a protector, and yet every moment of his life was now an act of violation against the very people he felt compelled to protect. He began to watch the architect with new eyes. He saw the flicker of satisfaction on the Don's face when he witnessed a moment of tension between the sisters. He saw the proprietary way the Don looked at his daughters, not as children, but as his prize breeding stock. The Mastiff was a simple man, a man of violence and obedience, but he was not a fool. He was beginning to understand that his master, the architect, was not building a dynasty. He was building a mausoleum. The first true test of the architect's monstrous dynasty came, as he had willed it, when Isabella discovered she was pregnant. The news was received not with joy, but with a chilling, solemn finality. For Don Morello, it was the ultimate vindication of his plan. He became almost giddy, his obsession now validated by the promise of a new generation, a grandson forged from his daughter's blood and his soldier's strength. He hovered over Isabella, dictating her diet, her exercise, her very hours of sleep. The unborn child was not a baby, it was a project, the first true brick in his legacy. For Isabella, the pregnancy was a physical manifestation of her own subjugation. She felt like a vessel, a container for her father's ambition. Yet, as the months wore on, a powerful, primal instinct began to surface, a fierce, protective love for the child growing within her. This child would not be a monster. This child would not be a pawn. This child, she vowed, would be hers, and she would protect it from the madness of its grandfather. The pregnancy also forced a subtle shift in her relationship with Rico. He became even more protective, his silent presence a constant, reassuring weight. He would fetch her a glass of water before she asked, place a cushion behind her back when she sat, and glare at any household servant who made too much noise near her room. These were small, simple acts of kindness, but in the cold, transactional world of the Morello mansion, they were revelatory. Isabella began to see past the fearsome enforcer, past the instrument of her father's will, and saw a glimmer of the man beneath, a man burdened by his own role in her suffering. One evening, unable to sleep, she found him in the darkened kitchen, staring out at the moonlit garden. "You did not ask for this either," she said, her voice soft. It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of their shared prison. Rico turned, his face etched with a profound weariness. "No," he rumbled. "I did not." In that quiet moment of shared confession, something shifted between them. The hatred and fear that had defined their relationship began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative understanding. They were not husband and wife, but they were allies, bound by their mutual captivity and a shared, unspoken desire to protect the innocent child that was coming into their world. Sophia watched this burgeoning, silent partnership with a venomous jealousy. She saw Isabella's pregnancy not as a tragedy, but as a victory that she herself had been denied. Her own forced encounters with Rico were cold, rage-filled acts of defiance on her part, and grim duty on his. Where Isabella had found a sliver of humanity in their shared plight, Sophia saw only the continued evidence of her own humiliation. Her hatred for Rico intensified, but a new, more dangerous target was beginning to form in her mind: her own sister. She saw Isabella's belly grow and interpreted her sister's quiet resilience as a sign of complicity. She believed Isabella was embracing her role, becoming the queen of their father's new, twisted world, while she and Lucia were left to rot. The seed of rebellion was beginning to sprout in the house, but it was a twisted, poisoned seed. It was not a united front against the tyrant, but a bitter rivalry between his captives. The architect, in his madness, could not have designed a more perfect method of control. He had not only caged his daughters, but he had turned them into their own jailers. While Isabella's pregnancy became the central drama of the household, and Sophia's anger festered like an untreated wound, Lucia, the youngest, simply disappeared. She was not physically gone, but her spirit had retreated so far into itself that she was little more than a ghost haunting the cavernous halls of the mansion. Her chosen sanctuary was the library, a vast two-story room lined with thousands of books her father had purchased by the yard for appearance's sake, but had never read. The room smelled of old paper and leather, a scent of worlds far removed from the brutal reality of her own. Lucia spent her days and most of her nights there, curled in a large armchair, the light from the tall arched windows tracing the dust motes in the air. She ate little, spoke less, and seemed to subsist entirely on the printed word. She was starving herself, not just of food, but of the ugly, suffocating life her father had forced upon her. Her sisters, consumed by their own dramas, initially paid little attention to Lucia's decline. Isabella was focused on her pregnancy and her fragile alliance with Rico. Sophia was lost in a fog of rage and jealousy. They saw Lucia's withdrawal as an odd quirk, a quiet coping mechanism. They failed to see that she was not coping, she was dying. Rico was the one who noticed. His guard duties often took him past the library, and he would see her through the crack in the door, a small, frail figure lost in the gloom. He saw the untouched food trays left outside her door. He saw the way her already slender frame seemed to shrink day by day. He saw the hollow, haunted look in her eyes, a look that went far beyond simple sadness into a realm of profound, bottomless despair. His guilt, already a heavy cloak, became a crushing weight. Of the three sisters, Lucia's fear of him was the most absolute, the most untainted by the complexities of pragmatism or rage. She was a pure victim of the circumstance he was forced to uphold. He felt a desperate, paternal urge to help her, but he didn't know how. His presence terrified her. His words, when he rarely used them, would make her flinch. One afternoon, he found a book left on a table outside the library. It was a collection of English poetry. He picked it up, his large, calloused fingers clumsy on the delicate pages. That evening, he left a small wild rose he had picked from the garden pressed between the pages of the book and placed it back on the table. It was a small, silent gesture, the only language he knew how to use to express the apology he could never speak. The breaking point came a week later. A housemaid, sent to clean the library, let out a piercing scream. Rico was the first to arrive. He found Lucia collapsed on the floor, her breathing shallow, her pulse a faint, fluttering beat. The book of poetry lay open beside her. In his arms, she felt as light as a bundle of twigs. As he carried her up the grand staircase, her sisters rushed out of their rooms. their faces masks of shock and dawning horror. They had been so consumed by their own survival that they had failed to see their youngest sister was fading away before their very eyes. Don Morello was furious. He saw Lucia's collapse not as a cry for help, but as an act of insolent defiance, a flaw in one of his pillars. He brought in a private doctor who administered sedatives and tonics, treating the symptom, not the disease. But as Lucia lay in her bed, drifting in a medicated twilight, Isabella and Sofia finally understood. Their father's plan was not just a perversion, it was a death sentence. It had broken Sofia's spirit, turned Isabella into a vessel, and was now literally killing Lucia. Staring at their sister's pale, still form, the hatred and jealousy that had divided them finally burned away, leaving only the cold, hard reality of their shared fate. For the first time, they were not rivals. They were sisters, and they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that if they did not find a way to fight back, they would all end up like Lucia, one way or another. Lucia's collapse was the catalyst. It shattered the fragile individual cages the sisters had built around themselves and forced them together. The night after the doctor came, Isabella and Sofia sat in vigil by Lucia's bedside, the silence of the room broken only by their sister's shallow breathing. The animosity between them had evaporated, replaced by a shared, simmering fear. "He is killing her," Sofia whispered, her voice raw with a grief that had finally overpowered her anger. "He is killing all of us." Isabella, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, nodded slowly. "I know," she replied. "I have been trying to survive, but survival isn't enough." In that moment, by the dim light of a bedside lamp, the rebellion was truly born. It was no longer a vague, desperate hope, but a conscious, deliberate conspiracy. They were their father's pillars, the foundations of his legacy, and they would bring the entire house down from the inside. Their first challenge was Rico. He was their jailer, the instrument of their father's will. But Isabella, through her quiet observations and fragile truces, had seen the conflict in his eyes. She believed he could be turned. Sofia, however, was not convinced. Her hatred for him was a deep, bitter root. "He is one of them," she hissed. "A loyal dog. He will go straight to father. He is a prisoner just like us," Isabella argued. "He feels the guilt of this more than any of us. Look at how he watches Lucia. He did not want this." The debate was settled by an unexpected voice, the rose. Lucia murmured, her eyes fluttering open. She was weak, her voice a thread of sound, but her gaze was clear. "He left a rose in my book." That small secret act of kindness was the proof they needed. It was a crack in the Mastiff's armor of loyalty, a sign that the man was not entirely lost inside the monster. They had to take the risk. They had to trust him. Their next secret meeting took place in the one place they knew their father would never enter, the nursery, a room being prepared for Isabella's child, filled with the scent of fresh paint and hope. They summoned Rico, who entered the room with a wary, uncertain look on his face. He expected anger, accusations. Instead, he found the three sisters standing together, a united front. Isabella, speaking for them all, laid out their proposition. It was not a plea, but a plan. A desperate, dangerous gambit to escape. "We know you are loyal to him," Isabella said, her voice steady. "He saved your life, but the life he is forcing you to live now, this is not a life. It is a sin, and the child I am carrying will not be born into it." Sofia, her arms crossed, watched him with narrowed, suspicious eyes, but she remained silent, honoring her pact with her sister. Lucia, leaning on Sofia for support, simply looked at him, her eyes pleading. Rico listened, his face an unreadable mask. He was a man of few words and fewer choices. His entire world, his entire identity, was built on the foundation of his loyalty to Antonio Morello. To betray him would be to betray the only code he had ever known. And yet, to continue to obey him was to participate in the slow, systematic destruction of these three women, and an innocent, unborn child. He looked from Isabella's determined face, to Sofia's simmering defiance, to Lucia's fragile hope. He was being asked to choose between his past and his future, between his maker and his conscience. After a long, agonizing silence,
He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The unholy trinity of the architect's dynasty, his 3 daughters and his 1 loyal soldier, had just become a conspiracy of 4. The rebellion had its general. Don Antonio Morello was a man who prided himself on seeing everything.
He had eyes and ears all over the city, and within his own home, he believed himself to be omniscient. He saw the new, fragile peace between his daughters, but he misinterpreted it. He saw their shared vigils at Lucia's bedside, not as the forging of an alliance, but as a natural, womanly response to sickness. He saw Sophia's subdued anger and believed her spirit was finally broken. He saw Isabella's calm resolve and mistook it for acceptance of her role as the mother of his dynasty. His arrogance was his greatest blind spot. He was so convinced of the genius of his own design, so certain of his absolute control, that he could not conceive of a genuine rebellion forming under his own roof. He had accounted for every external threat, but he never truly believed that his own pillars, the very foundation of his legacy, could be the ones to threaten him. He had bred them for what he perceived as their best qualities: Isabella's mind, Sophia's fire, Lucia's heart, and never imagined they would learn to combine those traits into a weapon against him. The conspirators used his arrogance to their advantage. They played their parts perfectly. Sophia feigned a new, broken submissiveness. Lucia remained the fragile invalid, her slow recovery a perfect excuse for her sisters to remain constantly by her side, their hushed conversations easily mistaken for concerned whispers. Isabella, as the expectant mother, was the perfect distraction, her impending delivery the focus of the entire household. Their plot was whispered into existence in the quiet of the nursery, a room that represented the future the architect desired, which they were now turning into the command center for his destruction. Rico, their most crucial and dangerous ally, played his own part with the silent stoicism that was his nature. He became even more attentive to the Don, more diligent in his duties, a model of unwavering loyalty. This was the most dangerous part of the game. If the architect sensed even a flicker of dissent from his prized soldier, the entire plan would crumble. But Rico's betrayal was so profound, so contrary to his entire life's history, that the Don was utterly blind to it. The plan they formulated was a testament to their combined strengths. Isabella, the strategist, devised the narrative. They would not just escape, they would disappear in a way that would utterly destroy their father's reputation and his power. They would create a story of betrayal so convincing that it would turn the architect's own paranoid world against him. Sophia, her fiery spirit now channeled into a cold, focused rage, was the agent of chaos. Her task was to secretly gather evidence of her father's dealings: ledgers, names, meeting locations, information that could be used to sow discord among his allies after they were gone. Lucia, the quiet observer, the one who had spent years fading into the background, became their ghost. She moved through the house unnoticed, listening at doors, observing routines, gathering the small, crucial details of guards' schedules and household patterns that would be essential for their escape. Rico was the key, the one who would make it all possible. His task was the most dangerous of all. He had to secure a route out, a safe house, and most importantly, find allies on the outside, men who hated the architect enough to help bring him down. He began to reach out, using the secret, coded language of the underworld, planting the seeds of betrayal that Isabella had designed. The architect saw his family functioning exactly as he had designed it, a well-oiled machine producing his legacy. He was completely unaware that the machine was being quietly, meticulously rewired to self-destruct. Isabella's due date approached, and the tension in the Morello mansion became a thick, palpable thing. Don Morello was consumed with the impending birth of his heir, a mania that made him both more distracted and more dangerously unpredictable. This was the moment the conspirators had been waiting for. The birth of the child, the symbol of his dynastic triumph, would be their Trojan horse. It was the one event that would have the architect's complete and undivided attention, the perfect cover for their final, desperate move. Their plan was now fully formed, a complex piece of machinery with every gear and spring carefully placed. Sophia, using a key she had stolen from her father's desk, had managed to access his private study. Night after night, she had secretly photographed pages of his ledgers, the ones that detailed the payoffs to judges, the locations of his hidden distilleries, and most damningly, the names of men in rival families who were secretly on his payroll. This information was a bomb, ready to be detonated. Lucia, their silent ghost, had mapped out the entire household's routine, a detailed schedule of every servant's duties and every guard's patrol route. She had discovered a 2-minute window between 3 and 3:02 a.m. when the guard on the east gate would leave his post to get coffee from the kitchen. It was a tiny flaw in her father's fortress, but it was all they needed. Rico's work had been the most perilous. He had reached out to the only 2 men in Chicago he knew he could trust, the husbands of Sophia and Lucia. These were not powerful men. They were the sons of minor allies, chosen by the architect for their pliability and lack of ambition. They had been forced into their own sham marriages, living as glorified servants in their father-in-law's house, their wives bound to another man. Their humiliation had bred a deep and silent resentment. Rico approached them not as a threat, but as a fellow prisoner. He revealed the plan, offering them the one thing they craved more than money or power: freedom and the return of their wives. He told them they were to be the unsuspecting victims in the narrative Isabella had created. On the night of the escape, they would be seen drinking heavily with a known informant for the O'Banion gang. The next day, when the Don and his daughters were discovered missing, these 2 sons-in-law would become the prime suspects, the Judas goats who had sold out the family to their North Side rivals. They would be forced to flee, but Rico gave them a location, a safe house far out of the city where Sophia and Lucia would be waiting for them. It was a terrifying risk for them, but it was their only chance. The final piece of the puzzle was the most chilling. Isabella's strategic mind had concocted a story so potent it would poison the architect's name forever. After their disappearance, an anonymous package would be delivered to the city's most notorious gossip columnist. It would contain Sophia's photographs, along with a letter seemingly penned by a distraught Isabella. The letter would detail her father's madness, his perverse breeding experiment, and paint Rico, the Mastiff, not as a co-conspirator, but as a man who had finally snapped. It would claim that Rico, driven mad by the unnatural arrangement, had murdered the Don and the 2 traitorous sons-in-law and had kidnapped the 3 sisters and the newborn child, fleeing to start a new, twisted family of his own. The story was a masterpiece of misdirection. It would protect their outside allies, explain the disappearances, and turn the architect's most loyal soldier into the monster of a legend that would forever tarnish the Morello name. The stage was set. All they needed now was the cue. And it came on a stormy Tuesday night when Isabella's water broke. The birth was a long and arduous affair, a storm inside the house that mirrored the one raging outside. The doctor, a nervous man who owed his practice to the Don, worked under the watchful, obsessive gaze of the architect himself. Don Morello paced outside the bedroom door like a caged tiger, his excitement a terrifying, predatory thing. He had barred everyone else from the floor, including Rico, wanting to be the first to lay eyes on his heir. For the sisters and Rico, these were the longest hours of their lives. Every tick of the clock was a countdown to their own liberation or their execution. They communicated with furtive glances, with tiny, almost imperceptible nods. Sophia slipped away to plant the package of evidence in a pre-arranged mail drop. Lucia confirmed the guard schedules one last time. Rico met with the 2 sons-in-law, Marco's and Lucia's intended, in the wine cellar, finalizing their role in the night's dark theater, ensuring they were seen by the household staff getting drunk and belligerent, establishing their alibi of recklessness. Finally, just before 2 a.m., the cry of a newborn baby echoed through the hall. It was a boy. The architect, his face split by a triumphant grin, burst into the room. He barely glanced at Isabella, pale and exhausted in the bed. His eyes were only for the child. He took the baby from the doctor, holding him aloft like a trophy. "My heir," he boomed, his voice thick with emotion. The first son of the new Morello dynasty. He was so consumed by his victory, so lost in his moment of triumph, that he didn't notice the cold, hard look in his daughter's eyes. He didn't notice the unnatural quiet of the house. He didn't notice that the climax of his grand design was, in fact, the beginning of his end. While he was distracted, Rico moved. The first step was to deal with the two sons-in-law. Their part in the drama was to become the first victims, the foundation of the false narrative. Rico met them in the billiards room, as planned. They were drunk, as instructed, full of a nervous, liquid courage. They believed they were moments away from escaping with their wives. Rico poured them one last drink, a glass of the Don's finest scotch. They toasted to their future, but the scotch was laced with a fast-acting, tasteless poison Rico had acquired through his underworld contacts. Their deaths were swift and silent, their bodies arranged to look like they had passed out from drink before being killed. It was a brutal, necessary betrayal, a sacrifice Isabella had deemed essential to sell the story. There could be no loose ends. Next was the doctor. As the man packed his bag, relieved to be leaving the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion, Rico was waiting for him at the bottom of the stairs. A single, swift, and silent blow. The doctor's body was placed in his own car, which would be driven to a remote quarry and abandoned. Now, there was only one obstacle left: the architect himself. Rico ascended the grand staircase, his heart a heavy, cold stone in his chest. This was the man who had saved him, the man he had served his entire life. This was the final, ultimate betrayal. He entered the master bedroom. The Don was still there, cradling the baby, whispering to him of the empire he would one day inherit. Isabella lay in the bed, watching, waiting, her face a pale mask of resolve. The climax of the entire sordid affair had arrived. When Rico entered the room, the architect looked up, his face still glowing with a euphoric pride. "Look, Mastino," he said, his voice softer than Rico had ever heard it. "Look at what we have made. Perfection, strength, legacy." For a fleeting second, Rico hesitated. The years of ingrained loyalty, of a boy's gratitude to his savior, warred with the man's resolve. He looked at the baby, so small and innocent in the old man's arms. He looked at Isabella, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. That look was all it took. He was not here to betray a savior. He was here to liberate a prisoner and protect a child. "It's over, Don Antonio," Rico said, his voice a low, final rumble. The architect's smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, which quickly curdled into rage. "You?" he hissed, his eyes narrowing. "My dog dares to bark at me?" He carefully placed the baby in the bassinet beside the bed, never taking his eyes off Rico. He was old, but he was still a wolf. He reached for a drawer in the bedside table where Rico knew he kept a small, pearl-handled pistol. But Isabella had planned for this. While her father's back was turned, she had taken the gun. Now she held it in her trembling hands, pointing it not at her father, but at her own newborn son. "Don't move," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Or I swear to God this dynasty ends right now." The architect froze, his hand hovering over the drawer. He stared at his daughter, his mind unable to process this ultimate act of defiance. To threaten the heir, the very symbol of his life's work. It was an insanity that surpassed even his own. "You are bluffing," he snarled, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "A mother would never harm her own child." "You made me a mother," Isabella retorted, her voice gaining strength. "But you have no idea what a mother is capable of." This was the distraction Rico needed. While the architect's attention was fixed on the standoff between his daughter and his legacy, Rico closed the distance between them. There was no rage in his movements, no malice. It was a grim, methodical act, like felling a great, rotten tree. He did not use a gun. That was too loud, too messy. He used his hands. The hands that had protected the Don for 2 decades now closed around his throat. The struggle was brief, but terrible. The architect was strong, fueled by a lifetime of violence and a final, incandescent surge of pure fury. But he was no match for the raw, focused power of the Mastiff. As the life faded from his eyes, the last thing Antonio Morello saw was the face of his most loyal creation, the instrument of his own undoing. The silence that fell in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft, steady breathing of the newborn child. It was over. The architect was dead. Rico stood over the body, his chest heaving, the ghost of a lifetime of loyalty finally exorcised. Isabella lowered the gun, her body racked with a storm of sobs, of relief, of horror, of grief for the father he might have been, and of profound, liberating freedom. They had done it. They had torn down the house from the inside. Now, all that was left was to escape the ruins. The final act was a race against the dawn. With the architect dead, the house was theirs, but only for a few precious hours. The plan, so meticulously designed, now unfolded in a grim, silent ballet. Rico, his face set like stone, dealt with the body of his former master. There would be no furnace this time, no crude disposal. The architect's demise had to be a mystery, a void at the center of the story. Using the service elevator and a series of hidden passages he knew from his years of guarding the mansion, he transported the body, along with those of the two poisoned sons-in-law, to a sub-basement, a forgotten, bricked-up section of the foundation from the original 19th century structure. It was a tomb within the house, a place no one would ever think to look. He sealed the entrance with fresh mortar, a final act of burying the past. While Rico worked, the sisters prepared for their new lives. They took nothing that belonged to the Morello identity. No jewels, no fine clothes, no money from the house safe. They packed simple, worn dresses, the kinds of clothes that would allow them to blend in, to become anonymous. Isabella bundled her baby, who had slept through the entire terrible ordeal, in a simple warm blanket. They were shedding their old skins, leaving the gilded cage behind forever. At precisely 3 a.m., during the 2-minute window Lucia had identified, they made their move. Rico led them through the darkened gardens, his massive form a shield against the shadows. They slipped through the east gate, its lock expertly picked by Rico minutes before, and into a waiting car, a drab, unremarkable sedan he had purchased with his own meager savings. Sophia and Lucia were dropped at a pre-arranged location, a small, all-night diner where their husbands' cars were parked. Their final instructions were clear. Drive west, don't stop, and wait for word at the safe house Rico had secured. The sisters embraced. A final, tearful farewell. They had been to hell and back together. And now their paths were diverging, each sister on her own desperate flight toward an uncertain freedom. Rico, Isabella, and the baby drove east toward the rising sun. Their destination was New York, a city vast enough to swallow them whole. They had a new set of identification papers, expertly forged by one of Rico's contacts, and a small amount of cash, enough to start over. They would become the Costas, a simple immigrant family, another anonymous story in the teeming metropolis. As they drove out of Chicago, the first rays of dawn were breaking over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in hues of gray and rose. Isabella looked back at the city, the skyline of the empire her father had built and that she had just destroyed. There was no triumph in her heart, only a profound, aching weariness, and the fierce, quiet hope that comes with survival. The Morello dynasty was gone, vanished in the night. The legend was about to begin. The story broke like a thunderclap. The morning staff at the Morello mansion arrived to find a house of eerie silence. The Don was gone. His 3 daughters were gone. His new grandson was gone. The 2 sons-in-law were gone. The discovery of the abandoned, blood-spattered car of the family doctor near the quarry only added to the mystery. The city's newspapers, fueled by anonymous tips from the package Sophia had sent, went into a frenzy. The lurid, shocking story Isabella had fabricated became the official narrative. It was a tale of lust, madness, and monstrous betrayal. Rico Il Mastino Bastone, the loyal enforcer, had gone insane. He had slaughtered the Don and his sons-in-law, kidnapped the 3 sisters and the baby, and vanished into the night. The photographs of the Don's secret ledgers, published alongside the story, created chaos in the underworld. The alliances the architect had so carefully built crumbled overnight. His secret partners turned on each other, each suspecting the other of being in on the betrayal. The Morello crime family, without its head and poisoned by paranoia, devoured itself from within, collapsing into a bloody civil war that left a power vacuum in the Chicago underworld for years to come. The legend of the Mastiff and the stolen Morello women became a permanent part of Chicago's dark folklore, a cautionary tale about the beast within, about the loyalty of a dog that can curdle into the obsession of a wolf. No one ever questioned the story. It was too perfect, too cinematic, too deliciously depraved to not be true, and no one ever looked for them. Rico and Isabella, now Mr. and Mrs. Costa, settled in a quiet neighborhood in Queens. He found work as a laborer, his great strength once again put to use, but this time to build, not to destroy. She raised their son, who grew up knowing nothing of the blood-soaked legacy he had been born into. Their life was not one of passion, but of quiet, profound peace. A partnership forged in the fires of a shared trauma. They were two survivors, adrift on the same life raft, who had found a calm harbor. Sophia and Lucia, after a harrowing journey, were reunited with their husbands at the safe house. They too took new names, moving further west to California, where they lost themselves in the burgeoning crowds of a new, sun-bleached world. The sisters stayed in contact through coded letters sent to a post office box in New York, their bond, forged in their father's prison, remaining unbreakable. Decades later, in the 1970s, the old Morello mansion, long abandoned and rumored to be cursed, was finally demolished to make way for a modern skyscraper. As the wrecking balls tore into the foundations, a construction worker found a sealed-off chamber in the sub-basement. Inside, they found the skeletal remains of 3 men. The discovery briefly revived the old legend, but the police, with no new evidence, and no desire to reopen the books on a ghost story that was 50 years cold, filed it away as an unsolved mystery. The architect and his failed dynasty were finally, officially, laid to rest. The truth was never discovered. It lived on only in the quiet memories of 4 people who had escaped a monster's dream, and in the unspoken history of a generation that was allowed to be born free. It serves as a final, chilling reminder that the most formidable empires are often not destroyed by armies or rivals, but by the quiet, desperate rebellion of those trapped within the walls.